I spent 20 years hating my father for leaving me. For most of my life, I believed my father had abandoned me without a second thought. Then, after my mother died, I found something I was never meant to see in an old cedar box hidden in her attic. My last memory of him was the night after my 6th birthday. I heard him arguing with my mother downstairs. Their voices rose and clashed for what felt like forever. And then suddenly, there was silence. For over 3 minutes, I heard nothing from either of them. Then I heard my father again. His voice was quieter now. He kept talking for a long time. I was scared as I lay in bed that night. Then he came upstairs, sat beside me, and talked me to sleep, smiling like he cared. I asked him why they had been shouting. He said, "Don't worry about me and Mom. Adults sometimes raise their voices just to be understood. Everything is fine." I believed him. By morning, when I woke up, my daddy was gone. No goodbye I could remember, no explanation that made any sense to a little girl who stood by the window every evening, waiting for headlights that never turned into our driveway. My mother only ever said one thing: he made his choice. And after enough years, I made mine too. I chose to hate him. The night before he left, he had said everything was fine. He tricked me. That anger burned like a volcano inside me. I hate my dad. That sentence had lived inside me so long, it stopped feeling like anger and started feeling like truth. I blamed him for every school event where other kids had 2 parents in the audience and I had 1. I blamed him for every time I pretended I was fine when I wasn't. I blamed him for the way I never trusted people who said they loved me, because I had already learned that love could leave and never come back. I hated the way people lowered their voices whenever they asked about him, as if pity was somehow polite. And more than anything, I hated what his absence turned me into. He became the ghost I built my identity around. He didn't love me enough to stay. I told myself I didn't need him. And for 20 years, I never allowed myself to question that story. Then my mother died. The only parent in my life chose to leave me too. The only woman I went to for everything. Images of her tired hands baking me cakes on the kitchen counter kept flashing through my mind. She was my warmth whenever everything felt cold. My inspiration to keep paddling through life's struggles. My mother was my strength and my confidant. I was shattered beyond recognition, but somehow I picked myself up. If my father had been any use to me at all, it was that his absence had taught me a rare kind of strength, the ability to remain calm under the harsh realities of the world, the strength to survive in solitude. But even then, it was not enough. At that point, I hated my father even more. I blamed him for her death. Maybe if he had not left, she would not have died. I felt so cold and lonely. A kind of loneliness I had never known before. The funeral was small, quiet, heavy in the way grief always is when there are too many things left unsaid. People kept hugging me, telling me how strong I was, how much my mother had sacrificed, how lucky I had been to have her. I nodded through all of it. But after everyone left, I stayed behind at the house. I was now the only one left in the home I had grown up in, and that house felt colder than I remembered. Like every wall had spent years swallowing words no one was brave enough to say. The kitchen still smelled faintly of cinnamon and detergent. I spent days moving things around the house. Most times, the strength did not come naturally. I would simply drift from room to room, looking at things without really seeing them. Then suddenly, one afternoon, I found myself in the attic without knowing what I was doing there. I was not looking for anything in particular. I guess grief makes you do odd things. That was when I saw the old cedar box. I was immediately drawn to it. I pushed through the dust and cobwebs and dragged it closer to me. It was completely sealed. The ribbon around it had never been opened. Curiosity rose in me, and I quickly grabbed whatever I could find nearby to pry it open and unravel the mystery inside. At first, it felt almost exciting. But the moment I opened it, that excitement disappeared. Inside were letters, dozens of them, all addressed to me. And every single one was in my father's handwriting. My breath caught in my throat. For a long moment, I just stared. My fingers felt too weak to move, but my heart was pounding like it was trying to break out of my chest. He had written to me. Not once, not twice, for years. The first letter sat on top, yellowed at the edges, my name written across the front with a tenderness I could feel before I opened it. My hands shook as I unfolded it. It began, "My little girl, if this letter ever reaches you, then life has done me one mercy I do not deserve." I froze. That was not the voice of a man who had forgotten us. I kept reading. In that first letter, he wrote about the night he left. He wrote that the argument between him and my mother that I had heard was not about another woman, not about him leaving us forever, not about him no longer wanting to be a husband or a father. It was about an offshore project he had agreed to, a dangerous one, a long one, a job out at sea that would keep him away for months, but would bring in more money than he had ever earned before. He wrote that he took it because he was tired of watching my mother stretch every dollar until it almost tore in her hands. He was tired of seeing her count bills at the table after I had gone to sleep. He wanted more for us, better schooling for me, a safer home, a future that didn't feel like survival from one week to the next. But my mother had not wanted him to go. She was terrified. He had never done anything like that before. She thought the job was too risky. She did not want him out at sea for so long. She would rather struggle with him alive and beside her than live in comfort with the sea between them. That was what they were arguing about. By the second letter, my heart was already beginning to shift. All those years when my mother had said he made his choice, I thought she meant he chose to leave us. But she had meant he chose to go on that trip, not to abandon us, just to go. I sat there in the attic, letter trembling in my hand, while that truth slowly cracked open inside me. I reached for the next one, then the next. He wrote from the offshore vessel at first. The first few letters were hopeful. He told me he imagined me running around the house asking endless questions, tugging at my mother's clothes, refusing to sleep unless someone rubbed my back. He said he counted the days until he would be home. Then the letters changed. The handwriting got rougher, more hurried, less steady. One letter explained that somewhere along the route, men they worked alongside were discovered to be moving illegal goods, drugs. He wrote that the crew had no full understanding of what was happening at first. By the time the authorities swooped in, it was chaos. Raids, shouting, arrests, gunfire. In the confusion, an officer was killed. Everyone connected to that route was swept into the same trafficking case. Once an officer died during the raid, the charges widened, the penalties hardened, and individual innocence stopped mattering. He wrote, "Out here, guilt and proximity became the same thing." I swallowed hard and kept reading. He was arrested, detained, charged. What should have been a few months away became a nightmare that swallowed 15 years of his life. 15 years? I pressed the letter to my mouth and cried. Suddenly, I could hear my mother's old sentence in a different voice. Not bitter in the way I had always heard it, but wounded, broken. He made his choice. Yes, he chose the trip, and that one choice destroyed all of them. The next letters were from prison. At first, I read them with anger still clinging to me. But the more I read, the less room anger had to stand. He wrote about missing my 7th birthday, then my 8th, then my first day of middle school. He wrote about lying awake on a metal bunk, trying to picture how tall I had become. He wrote about hearing other men laugh on visiting days while he sat alone, watching the gate, knowing no one was coming for him. One letter said, "The hardest part is not the prison walls. It is knowing my daughter is growing up somewhere under the same sky and I cannot even say goodnight." Another said, I used to think pain was loud, but the deepest pain is quiet. It is hearing your child's age change every year in your head and realizing you no longer know her face at that age. I covered my face and wept. For the first time in my life, I did not see a man who abandoned me. I saw a man trapped inside consequences that had outgrown him. A man who had made one risky decision trying to provide for his family, and then watched that decision ruin everything. A man who had loved us from a cage. The letters kept coming. He wrote of humiliation, of prison food that made him sick, of nights so long he feared he would lose his mind. He wrote of men hardening around him, of learning to survive without becoming one of them. He wrote of fights he avoided, of insults he swallowed, of sickness he endured alone. He wrote that shame had become his second sentence. But even in there, he kept thinking of us. He wrote to my mother too, though there were fewer letters for her in the box. In one of them, he explained that as soon as it became clear he would be jailed, he transferred what he had left into a separate account and sent her the details, hoping it would help with my school tuition and our upkeep. The moment I read that, a memory slammed into me. I was maybe 9 or 10. I remembered waking up one night and seeing my mother crying quietly at the edge of her bed. I had asked her what was wrong. She wiped her face quickly and pulled me close. Then she told me not to worry, that some money had come for my schooling and for the house, that things would be okay for a while. I never knew where that money came from. It had come from him. All those years I had lived on sacrifices I did not even know were his. I could barely breathe. The more I read, the more my childhood rearranged itself in my mind. My mother had not hated him because he was a wicked man who walked away from us. She had resented him because his decision had shattered the life they were trying to build. She had loved him once. Maybe she never fully stopped. Maybe that was why the pain in her was so deep. No wonder she never opened the box. No wonder she kept his truth tied shut in the attic. Opening it would have meant facing the man she still could not forgive, and maybe the man she had never fully stopped loving. It would have meant accepting that the story she had survived on was more complicated than anger. If that box had arrived with news of his death, then opening it would have meant reopening every wound she had spent years forcing shut. The letters from his later years in prison hurt the most. He said he had stopped asking why life had become so merciless. He only prayed that I was growing into someone kind, someone educated, someone strong. He hoped I had graduated. He hoped I had not let his disgrace stain my name. He hoped the money had reached us. He hoped my mother had built some kind of peace from the wreckage. Then I found a letter dated shortly after his release. My eyes widened. He had been released 3 years ago. 3 years. 3 whole years he had been out in the world while I was still here hating him like he was forever frozen in the act of leaving. That letter was different. There were no prison bars in his words now, but there was something else. Distance, hesitation, fear. He wrote that freedom had not felt the way he imagined it would. The world had moved on without him. His body was older, his name carried shame. He had thought of coming to see us many times, but every time he imagined it, he saw my face harden with the same hatred he had already felt through the silence of the years. No one had visited him in prison. No one had written back. He had taken that silence as his answer. He wrote, "If you hated me, I could not blame you. If your mother hated me, I earned some part of that too. I thought maybe the least damage I could do after all these years was to stay away and let you both keep whatever peace you had built without me." I broke all over again. Because now I understood something I had never allowed myself to imagine before. He did not stay away because he didn't care. He stayed away because he believed we did not want him. And maybe because after prison, after disgrace, after 15 years of loss, he no longer knew how to knock on the same door he had once left behind with hope. The next few letters were softer, lonelier. He wrote about small jobs, about trying to live quietly, about being haunted by our memories, about passing little girls on the street and wondering if I had once sounded like that when I laughed. He wrote that some nights he sat alone and replayed my 6th birthday in his mind, because that was the last full day he had ever had with me. Then came the letter that changed me completely. It was not the saddest one. It was the gentlest. He wrote, "If there is one thing I pray you never believe, it is that I left because I stopped loving you. I have lived in too much darkness for that lie to survive in me. I loved you when the sea was under me. I loved you when the prison walls stood around me. I loved you when no one came. I loved you when I stepped back into a world that no longer knew my name. If I stayed away after that, it was not because I did not want my family. It was because I no longer knew whether my family could survive the sight of what life had made of me." By then, I was no longer just crying. I was grieving the father I thought I had lost, grieving the man I was only now beginning to know, grieving every year I spent hating him while he was somewhere carrying us in silence. And then, for the first time in my life, a thought came into my heart that had never once crossed my mind before. I want to see my father, not to question him, not to accuse him, just to see him, to hear his voice, to know how old pain had shaped his face, to tell him I finally understood more than I ever wanted to tell him I was sorry too. My hands turned frantic as I searched through the box for an address, a number, anything recent that could lead him to me.
That was when I found one final envelope tucked beneath the letters. It was not in his handwriting. It was addressed to my mother. Inside was a short note from the caretaker of the apartment where my father had last lived. The cedar box had been found among his belongings after his passing. Since my mother was listed as the only known contact, it had been sent to her, along with notice of his death. Notice of his death. My body went numb. He had died. Not recently, he had died within a few years of getting out, before he ever found the courage to come back. The box had reached my mother, and she had never opened it. She had taken his last words, his pain, his love, his years of silence, and locked them away above the ceiling where only grief would one day find them. I stared at the note until the words blurred. Then the truth hit me in its final, most merciless form. I had finally found my father, and I had found him too late. I bent over the box and sobbed so hard my chest ached. Not just for him, not just for me, for all of us. For my mother, who had spent years resenting the man whose choice destroyed their life, but who must have also loved him too deeply to bear reading his final words. For my father, who had lived through prison, disgrace, loneliness, and release, only to die believing his daughter still hated him. For the child I had been, standing by windows, blaming the wrong ending for the wrong reason. I cried for the man I had spent 20 years refusing to miss. And that was the cruelest pain of all. Because I missed him now. I missed a father I could never get back. I missed conversations we never had. I missed apologies I never heard in person. I missed the chance to let him see that my face no longer held hatred. I missed the chance to tell him that I understood at last that adulthood is full of terrible choices, impossible turns, and punishments that outlive the mistake that caused them. I understood now that life is not as simple as children think it is. Sometimes one decision, made out of love and hope, can wreck everything. Sometimes people do not come back, not because they stopped loving you, but because shame, time, and suffering have convinced them they no longer know how. Sometimes a person can spend years paying for one wrong turn, and by the time they are free, love itself feels too fragile to touch. And sometimes adulthood teaches you the hardest lesson of all, that one terrible choice can ruin a life without erasing the love that existed inside it. That night, I carried the cedar box downstairs and sat with it until dawn. I read every letter again, this time not like an abandoned daughter, but like a grown woman looking straight into the ruined life of a man who had once only wanted to provide for his family and had lost nearly everything trying. And somewhere between those pages, my hatred dissolved. In its place was sorrow, love, longing, and a wound so much deeper than anger had ever been. Because anger kept him far away, but love made me reach for him, and there was no one there. By morning, I knew one thing with painful certainty. My father had never stopped loving me. He had only lost his way back to me, and by the time I found the truth, he was already gone. That is the tragedy I now live with. Not that my father left, but that I finally loved him and could no longer show him. Sometimes the deepest wounds in our lives are built on stories we never had the full truth about. This story reminds us that pain can hide love, silence can hide suffering, and one wrong choice can change everything without erasing what someone felt in their heart. Before you let hurt harden into hatred, seek understanding where you can, because sometimes the truth does not just break your heart, it heals it too. Please like, subscribe, and share this video. It helps this story reach someone who may need to hear it today.